All right, buddy. Welcome to Just the Facts with Rob McCoy. I'm here tonight with my good friend and political genius, Rich Rubino. How you doing, buddy?
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me on, Rob.
Absolutely. So I think that, good time for us to get together and talk about this
Unpack it. Yep.
2024 election, especially after the performance that we witnessed last night. And I think you, me, millions of other Americans and folks around the world watching that debate last night were left with, kind of one of those reactions. So just, out of curiosity, what were your thoughts?
Well, a couple of things. It wasn't that Donald Trump won the debate. I think Donald Trump was very much kind of blasé in many respects. It was that Joe Biden really lost the debate. I think the thought process with a lot of people was, particularly those in Joe Biden's orbit, was that Joe Biden may sometimes be gaffe prone, but that there's another Joe Biden behind the scenes. There's a Joe Biden that's a very good tactician, that's very tough at meetings, and you need to see that Joe Biden. That Joe Biden did not show up last night. And actually, toward the end of the debate, there was certainly Joe Biden had some good lines, and there were times when he kind of came to. But because of some of the gas he made, there's really kind of alarm bells going off within Democratic Party high command. They won't tell you this, but there are alarm bells going on, and they're saying we really need somebody else. Is Joe Biden the messenger that we need? They see Donald Trump as vulnerable. They see Donald Trump as beatable, but they really question whether somebody that's 81 years old is that person. I think that Joe Biden, when he was running, I think a lot of people thought that if he got elected, he would be a transitional figure, not a transmogrificational figure. What do I mean by that? Essentially, he would be a president who would be there for 4 years, and he would be there as kind of a conduit to another Democrat, to a younger Democrat who would run again. Instead, Joe Biden ran himself and had very nominal opposition for the Democratic presidential nomination. And now there are some Democrats who are saying we really might need to consider asking Joe Biden to step aside for the good of the party and in order for them to beat Donald Trump.
So a couple of things with that. I agree with you
Yep.
In regards to Trump's performance. I did not think it was a particularly strong performance on his end. I thought that there was a couple opportunities there that Biden lobbed him up some softballs there where he really could have hammered home on Biden with some things and just never did. And I don't think he ever delivered, that knockout punch or had, that moment where he really, hammered him on something, with policy or just had a comeback. To that point, I think that he was very, I don't want to say mild-mannered, but mild for Donald Trump, mild-mannered. I think you could see him, looking at Dana and Jake. You could see him, waiting his turn. He didn't talk over anything. He wasn't. I thought it was going to be the split screen of those two, and it was going to be Biden talking and Trump's, mouth going, and you just couldn't hear anything. I thought that's what it was going to be all night, and it really wasn't. So from that regard, I don't want to say I thought he was good, but I thought it was very, very different from him.
Yeah.
And and then
Yep.
kind of jumping on with the Biden's performance. What is his? I mean, and you know a lot more about this than I would. What is his team thinking? Like what? All we've heard for months, years, maybe, is that he is so sharp behind the scenes. Here's a guy that's doing cartwheels. He knows that he sits with world leaders and he does these things and he's as good as he's ever been. And I mean, he's not. He's clearly not. There is a cognitive decline there. It's pretty substantial. And I'm not talking about his ability to give a speech. Clearly, he can give a speech. He can read a teleprompter. He's very comfortable in front of an audience. As evidenced by his performance at the State of the Union, as evidenced today at his rally. But I mean, the format of the debate he agreed to, it was, I have to imagine that, no audience, two people in the room, and, not knowing the questions and just kind of, going for it. I don't know what they were thinking.
So here's the thing about Joe Biden. Joe Biden is really a fascinating figure in American history. He was literally the second youngest person ever elected to the United States Senate. He was
which he
elected.
mentioned last night.
What's that? Yes, yes,
He
absolutely.
did.
He mentioned that last
I went
night,
from the young guy to the old guy.
which is true.
Right.
When he won the first time, and think about this now, he won a United States Senate seat in 1972, the same day Richard Nixon beat George McGovern. Joe Biden was winning a Senate seat, a seat that nobody ever thought he could win, by the way, a seat that there was a guy named Caleb Boggs was the incumbent Republican senator, a very much moderate Republican senator, kind of businessman type Republican. No Democrat would run against him. Joe Biden was kind of on the B team or the C team. He kind of was the people thought, okay, he's going to run. He's going to put the flag up for the Democratic Party. Maybe he'll run again. He'll run for governor or something. He runs that race on a youth movement. He talks about his opponent who was in his 60s. He said the opponent was too old. He talked about how his opponent basically had old ideas. Joe Biden had new ideas. So Joe Biden gets elected, and as soon as Joe Biden gets elected, and think of this, by the way, while Richard Nixon is actually creaming him in a conservative state at the time of Delaware, Joe Biden is winning. While Richard Nixon is creaming the Democratic presidential nominee, Joe Biden is defeating an incumbent Republican senator. Think about that.
Interesting. In Connecticut. Wow.
In Delaware.
Oh, sorry, Delaware. Correct.
Yeah.
Yep, my bad.
And he gets
I was thinking Lieber. I don't know why I was thinking Joe Lieberman.
So he gets elected, and there's immediately people are saying this guy's the next Jack Kennedy. This guy's young. This guy's so talented. He serves 36 years in the United States Senate, and in 1987 was the first time he really seriously thought about running for president. And a lot of people thought this guy is very formidable. He's from kind of a tough state for Democrats to win in terms of Delaware. So he shows his electoral bona fides. And then it turns out that he has to drop out of the race because John Sasso, who worked for Mike Dukakis, found out that he had plagiarized certain speeches from Neil Kinnock, the Labor Party leader. And then it turned out that he had plagiarized speeches also from former Vice President Hubert Humphrey and from Robert Kennedy. So he drops out of that race. That was probably Joe Biden's time. That was where Joe Biden was the ideal candidate, but he goes back to the Senate. He's chairman at times of both the Judiciary Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee. He's just on just about every Sunday talk show, becomes a household word really in the United States Senate. And people still think that this guy at some point might be a formidable presidential candidate. He runs in 2008, does very well in the debates. I ask everybody to go back and watch him in the 2008 presidential debates. The problem was in 2008, people were looking for somebody from outside of Washington, from outside of the Beltway, and someone who opposed the Iraq War, which was not who Joe Biden was. So Joe Biden does not do well, gets less than 1% of the Iowa caucuses, goes back to the Senate. Eventually, Barack Obama needs somebody that's very labor intensive, somebody who appeals to labor, chooses Joe Biden as his running mate. Joe Biden in that debate with Sarah Palin probably beats Sarah Palin, becomes vice president, becomes very popular within the Democratic Party. At a time, by the way, Barack Obama was not popular nationally. Joe Biden, in 2010, barnstorms the country, campaigning for just about every Democrat, running from Cemetery Commission to United States Senate. Barack Obama was too unpopular to campaign for a lot of those candidates, but Joe Biden was very popular. He had a lot of bona fides with labor leaders, very popular in the African-American community. 2012, he debates Paul Ryan, does very well against Paul Ryan. Then in 2016, that could have been his time as well, where he was seriously thinking about running. He would be the natural successor of incumbent President Barack Obama.
Yeah.
But then his son Bo dies. He doesn't run. He goes back in 2000, and after 2016, he goes back to Delaware. I think the thought process when he was going to retire, he was going to live out his last years, hanging out at Rehoboth Beach in Delaware. He does not do that. He decides he's going to run for president himself in 2020 again. Loses poorly in New Hampshire. Loses badly, loses Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. Think about all 43 of the first states he loses. Then it comes down to South Carolina. And in South Carolina, and yes, Jim Clyburn, it. The congressman from South Carolina, the majority whip, very popular in the African-American community, basically says, we want somebody who can be elected. Bernie Sanders cannot be elected. I think the thought process is that as soon as Bernie Sanders gets nominated, he's going to be torn. He's going to be caricatured as a Northeast socialist, and he's going to lose badly in the general election. So what do? The African-American community rallies to Joe Biden. Joe Biden does very well in South Carolina, goes on to win the nomination, and actually ran a pretty formidable campaign in 2006. In 2020, he was very sharp in many respects. He becomes president his first 2 years. I think the thought process was that he was going to pretend that he was going to run for another term, but he really wasn't going to run for another term. He was only doing that because he didn't want to be a lame duck. Once you tell people you're not going to serve out your full term, or you're not going to serve out your full term, or you're going to retire, people in Washington don't fear you. So people say, okay, he's just going to pretend he's going to run. Then he actually does run, and he runs for re-election, and he has only one major primary opponent, and that's Congressman Dean Phillips from Minnesota. He also had Marianne Williamson. But Dean Phillips makes the case that Joe Biden is somebody who is not going to be electable in the general election. He actually brings up the age issue in that primary, and Dean Phillips is kind of almost laughed off the political stage, wins about 19.7% of the vote in New Hampshire, eventually has to drop out. And the Democrats were thinking, the Democratic Caucus Committee were thinking, well, Joe Biden, you have to understand that the same Joe Biden from 1988, the same Joe Biden from 2008, that Joe Biden is still there. And once you get into debate, you prepare this guy for 6 days, you're going to see that Joe Biden, and people are going to say, well, age is just a number. Age is a numerical thing. What does age actually mean? The problem was that completely backfired. And now the Democrats are looking at their arsenal and they're thinking, is there any possible way that we can have somebody else as the Democratic presidential nominee, to the point that even some of his surrogates were saying, their basic argument was, well, you can't debate. He's done a good job for 3 years, but what about 3.5 years? You can't judge him by one debate. But I think there's definitely a lot of panic amongst the Democratic Party.
And truthfully, the Democrats, me looking at it, all they've done is apologize for him and tell everybody that, oh, it's one conspiracy theory after another, or it's, this is a doctored video and you don't know what you're talking about. And he's as sharp as a tack and he's as good as he's ever been. And you should see him with these people. I mean, it is clear he is not. It's clear. So you can only tell people so many things before they're going to start to really question this. And I mean, how can they question? I mean, how can they trust anything? Don't get me wrong. He does happen to be running against a guy that, wouldn't know the truth if it, landed on his kitchen table. But I don't know what they're thinking. I think about that, and I get it. Joe Biden's a stubborn guy. Joe Biden is as, experienced a politician as we've ever had, but
literally,
and right. And his wife is there in the spin room. Joe, you did such a great job. You answered all the questions. It's like they talk to him like he's a child. And this poor guy who is, just a nice, good man. And, all even, CNN right afterwards last night, I've never seen, those folks react the way that they did. And I mean, a guy, Van Jones, who I just think is tremendous, is almost in tears because he has such an affinity for Joe Biden. And, he loves him, and, he's worked with him and he's done so many things with them. And to think that they put him out there last night in this situation, in this setting, and then they're talking today that they'll do another one. I mean, what unless it's with a teleprompter and notes, and you get the questions beforehand. And I mean, he's got somebody, standing up behind, holding up signs, telling them how to answer. I don't know how he handles it, because those were not difficult questions last night. And I mean, and to that point, I thought that Jake Tapper and Dana Bash were phenomenal last night. I mean, I thought they were
best I've ever seen.
Oh, a true. And, I was going to ask you about that, in all the debates that you've seen, dozens more than I have. I've never seen moderators that were just read the questions, stayed on topic. And then not only that, but they'd say, okay, yeah. You have 87 seconds left for this answer. Do you want to add anything else?
And they weren't part of the story.
No, and they made this, and it was, here you go. Let's let these two people go. At one point, one of the ramble answers that Biden went on when he was talking about rape and incest and in-laws and stuff, that Dana did kind of cut him off. She was like, thank you. Let's, move on. I think she just, kind of felt bad for him in that moment. But I don't know. It's just a complete, total utter, like, what are you guys thinking with this? And, if that's what 6 days of straight debate preparation got, that scares me. It really does.
I hear a lot about the term over preparation. And my guess,
Yes,
by the way, is that inside he was probably a lot, inside Camp David in the mock debates, he was probably a lot better. It reminds me
sure.
a lot when you're studying for a test. Sometimes when you're studying for a test in school, sometimes you can keep preparing and preparing and preparing, or an oral presentation, something like that. And you can get over prepared because you're so nervous and it actually kind of hurts you. That's why, for example, it's better a couple hours before a debate or a couple hours before a test to do something just completely different. Like Bill Clinton, for example, in 1992, before his debates, Paul Begala used to talk to him about poetry, and they talk about things that they've read just to get him kind of off of that. So in the case of Joe Biden, my guess is he was a lot better, but I do think he was essentially overprepared. He has the weight of the world upon him. We've never had a president, a president the age of Joe Biden, and he has to
Right.
convince the American people that he still has the mental acuity, the mental dexterity, the mental skills, if you will. And I think that everyone, all these 16 people are trying to put this in his head. This is what you're supposed to say. This is what you're supposed to say. This is what you're supposed to say. And he probably cracked in many respects. But then you see him today, and he's got a teleprompter. Gets a rousing ovation from a crowd. You
Mhm.
see him even last night in Atlanta at the victory party, and he's very good still in those settings where he has
Sure.
crowds that are with him. The problem is when he doesn't have those crowds when it's just him against his opponent, and that's where he cracked.
And I mean, and that it, there's only so many things that are going to be scripted, and you watch him at any media availability he has, and he's holding a card, and you can see the pictures of the reporters. Then you can
Yep.
see the question that they're going to ask him. Then you can see how he's going to answer it. And I mean, that's not leading. Like that's not presidential to me. I get it. Like everybody has cheat sheets and everybody has little note cards, especially when you give whatever you're talking about. But that's not. I mean, I just think to the debate he had with Paul Ryan in 2012, and some of the answers that he gave that night were mind-boggling, incredible. I can remember that. I remember that debate vividly. I remember how good he was, and I remember thinking, like, wow, like this is the adult table, and Paul Ryan should be at the kiddie table, over there eating in a different time, because and Biden was phenomenal that night, and he was laughing everything off, and he's like, okay, little boy, like, what are you bringing to me? And it was he had policy. He followed things up. He was direct. It was, again, he's got a little stutter. Okay, I mean, last night was not a little stutter. That was not an off night. That's cognitive decline, and it's scary. And it's scary to think that they're doubling down on things. Oh, it's President Obama with his tweet today. I certainly know about bad debates and all the different. Vice President Harris last night. Oh, let's not put 190-minute debate against 3.5 years. I mean, but the problem is that people are looking at it now for the next 4 years, not what you did the last 3.5 years. And I think that and then the New York Times just coming out and
Yep.
encouraging him to drop out. Has anything? These are some historical things that you can help me with. Has the New York Times ever done that?
I don't think the New York Times has done that, but you know what? It's interesting to see. Is there any precedent for this?
Yeah,
Theoretically, primaries are really just advisories because
right.
whoever wins the primaries does not necessarily win at the convention. Now, I'll give you a little bit of history. Back in 1968, Hubert Humphrey became the Democratic nominee. He never participated in any primaries. He was Lyndon Johnson's vice president. Eugene McCarthy, a senator from Minnesota, was racking up victories in the primaries. So at the
Mm-hmm.
convention, the people at the convention said, we want Hubert Humphrey. So Hubert Humphrey garners the nomination that year. So what happens? There are riots in the streets in Chicago because Hubert Humphrey supported the Johnson administration's persecution of the war in Vietnam. So
Okay.
Eugene McCarthy's people and Hubert Humphrey's people really have it out. Eugene McCarthy doesn't even endorse Hubert Humphrey till a week before the campaign. So after that, they're trying to figure out how to make it more equitable in the Democratic Party. George McGovern, a senator from South Dakota, and George Fraser, a congressman from California, get together and formulate the McGovern-Fraser Commission. What does that mean? That means they're going to give more powers to the primaries. So the primary voters will have more power. And in 1972, interestingly, knowing that those are the rules, George McGovern himself runs for president and lands up winning the Democratic presidential nomination. And there was a lot of opposition to his nomination because he was so liberal and because he opposed the Vietnam War. You get to the convention, and Jimmy Carter, a one-term governor of Georgia, gets up there at the convention and says, "We need Scoop Jackson." Henry Scoop Jackson, a moderate senator from Washington State who had lost to McGovern in the primaries. His actions go nowhere. But the point is, he was trying to prove that you could still have somebody, even though McGovern had won in the primaries. Because of the McGovern-Fraser Commission, George McGovern becomes a nominee, loses miserably. 4 years later, the Democratic Party nominates Jimmy Carter himself as the Democratic presidential nominee. So theoretically, the convention could say no to the primary voters. That's probably not going to happen, but it could happen. Now, what happens if Joe Biden, and this is the scenario you have, what happens if Joe Biden says, "I'm going to step down"? Then you're going to have a litany of candidates. Someone's going to nominate this person. Someone's going to nominate this person. Someone's going to nominate this person. And then you're going to have an actual convention that means something, not just a convention tailor-made so that some sort of an infomercial. You're actually going to have candidates get up and speak, and you're actually going to have people nominating that candidate. The last time you had anything similar to this was 1956. Adlai Stevenson, the former governor of Illinois,
Yep.
and the 1952 Democratic presidential nominee, garnered the Democratic presidential nomination again. And instead of choosing his own running mate, he told the convention, "You can choose whoever you want." So Al Gore Sr. from Tennessee was one of the nominees. John F. Kennedy was one of the nominees from Massachusetts. And Estes Kefauver, the senator from Tennessee, was the other senator from Tennessee, was one of the nominees. And the convention said, "We want Estes Kefauver." So Estes Kefauver became the Democratic presidential nominee. So how does this relate to 2024? If Joe Biden bows out, which I think most of the Democratic high command are absolutely begging him to do right now, they're beseeching him to do. If that were to happen, then you'd have probably a lot of governors, a lot of senators, everyone who's ever thought about running for president thinks this is their time. They're going to ask somebody to put their name in. They could go 37 ballots perhaps, and eventually you could have either somebody you've never heard of, somebody you're not thinking of, or somebody who's kind of a household word already. But theoretically, if the convention says, if their delegates to the convention say, "We really need to win this," if they think this is the only way we can save democracy, then somebody can go up there and can nominate somebody else. And then eventually the party high command could say, "We nix basically what the primary voters decided," and then they could put that person up. But if that would be very kind of undemocratic, but it's certainly something within the rules that is legally the Democratic Party, as a private club to a certain degree, can do.
Is there anything that says a state doesn't have to allow, like
Yep.
right now, there's, Joe Biden's won the primaries. Like, are the ballots set? Is there a date for that? Or is it determined based upon what the convention says? Like, how
Yep.
does that work? Is there any deadline for that? Like, you have to be on the ballot by a certain time, what,
Yep.
4, 5, 6 months in advance or whatever it might be?
There is. Joe Biden is not the Democratic presidential nominee right now. Donald Trump is not the Republican presidential nominee. The
Okay.
primary voters have given him, the primary voters in both cases have given him enough support that other candidates have dropped out, and they won what's really a superficial number of how many delegates the party say this person has to do to go to the convention and to win. And the conventions, and since 1968, this has worked for both parties. They have ratified what the primary voters have decided. Then once the party gets up there, and this is where you see the great state of
Yes.
Mississippi that everybody loves. I absolutely love it. And convention people saying, "We nominate for president of the United States the great senator, the great blah blah blah." That's when once that happens and they actually reach the number, that party has a nominee. Right
Okay.
now, Joe Biden is the nominee apparent, the nominee presumptive. I think most people believe he will be the nominee. But
Yep.
even though he won the primary, you could win every single primary. And in his case, he had nominal opposition. And then you go to the convention, and then theoretically the parties somebody could get up and say, I nominate somebody else. Then somebody else could say, we support this other person, and eventually that person could become the nominee of the Democratic Party. I think the chances of that are very slim, but theoretically it's possible.
So the purpose of the primary then is to
It's to see it's basically, and primaries were not built into the system. At first, it used to be that the conventions would choose the nominee. There was no
Yep.
such thing as a
Right.
primary. 1912 was really the first year you really, at the presidential level. By the way, the first state to ever institute a primary, do you know what it was? Think of the most obscure state you can think of.
Rhode Island.
It's a very small state, and in 1910 they instituted the primary. They're the first one. It's one that there are two of almost.
Dakota.
Yes, North Dakota.
North Dakota.
North Dakota was the first state to institute a primary. Then in 1912, on the Republican side, there was a primary. And William Howard Taft was the Republican, the incumbent president, relatively unpopular within the body politic. He lost the majority of the primaries. So Theodore Roosevelt was a former president and actually one of the ideological antecedents to William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft wins the nomination. Then Theodore Roosevelt thinks that William Howard Taft is too conservative, runs against him, wins some of the primaries. Then they go to the convention, and the convention chooses Taft. So Theodore Roosevelt says, I'm strict to the buff, and I'm going to throw my hat in the ring and run as a member of the Progressive Party instead of the Republican Party. And that's where the expression throw their hat in the ring probably originated. Some trivia there. So Theodore Roosevelt runs and actually does better in the general election than any other third-party candidate in American history, but they split the conservative vote, and Woodrow Wilson lands up winning. So what the question is, what are primaries? What is their general purpose? Part of it, and originally it came out of the progressive movement, it was to give the people more power than the conventions. It used to be that there was no such thing as a primary. You would go to the convention, and delegates would nominate who the Republican or who the Democratic nominee was going to be. There was not, the people had no say whatsoever, which means that you go to the convention, and conventions actually meant something. You had no idea whatsoever who the person that the party's going to nominate is going to be. So, for example, in 1880, James Garfield was there to nominate John Sherman from the state of Ohio, a favorite son candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. There are other candidates. Former President Ulysses S. Grant, for the first time really in American history that a president allowed somebody to nominate him for a third term. He'd actually served 2 terms, 1869 to 1877, then spent 4 years in the political wilderness, 2 years basically touring the world, becoming very popular, runs again. He doesn't get enough support. Other candidates don't get enough support. James G. Blaine's in there. Finally, on the 30th, James Garfield gets up and gives a speech for John Sherman, nominating John Sherman, and it's a deadlock convention. Someone says, why don't we nominate that guy? James Garfield is a lowly congressman from the state of Ohio. Then other people say, we should nominate that guy. Garfield says, oh no, I'm not nominating for nominating someone else. The 36th ballot, James Garfield becomes the Republican presidential nominee, and James Garfield becomes president of the United States that year. That's how it used to work. Today, you go through this entire process where you begin with Iowa, you go to New Hampshire, you go to South Carolina, and you go from state to state to try to choose this person. It's a lot more democratic, and people that are very low propensity voters actually have a say, as opposed to people who are just part of their party's high command.
Yeah, I mean, interesting, and I think after today, there's certain different sentiment around how Biden's going to handle this. And there was nothing today that indicated that he's going to step away from this, or, he's going to allow somebody else to be the nominee, or he's going to step aside, or, there's some, stuff going on behind the scenes with the establishment. And it's just, it's wild. I don't know. I mean, I'm very curious to see what the polls are going to say. I don't think we'll know until next week, end of next week sometime, when the updated polls come out and they, to get some reactions to some things. But I listened to a guy today say that, the best candidate ever run a campaign is the couch, and the couch, I know who lost last night. America lost last night. That was the big loser of the debate, and maybe the big winner of the debate was the couch.
Either the
Because
couch, or maybe theoretically, could it also be a third party candidate? Some people I think are now third party curious. People
yeah,
that are kind of low propensity voters are saying, "Oh, I might vote for Biden," might be looking at now and saying, "Is there any other alternative?" Which means that, well, you got Robert F. Kennedy Jr., you've got Cornel West, you have Jill Stein, you have
yep,
Chase Oliver, the Libertarian Party nominee. They now, politics, there's a vacuum, and a lot of these candidates are going to try to go into that vacuum and try to tell those voters, well, you really need to support me here. You need to support me here. You need to support me here. By the way, in terms of people that Joe Biden, the question is often asked, who might the Democratic Party actually nominate if not Joe Biden?
correct, yeah, that
And
would be
my guess is the person who they would nominate if this were to happen, the best case scenario for them is they nominate somebody from outside of Washington. It's harder for Donald Trump to nominate someone from outside of Washington than somebody from inside Washington, because then he can say that that person's part of the swamp. Then he can
yep,
try to link that person to Biden. A governor, especially a Southern governor like Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter, can inoculate their criticism that they're too liberal. So I would look at really right now for the Democratic Party, Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina. He's been elected in a southern state. His last time around, as Donald Trump was winning the state by 1.7 points, he won by about 4 points. He shows he has electoral bona fides to the South, and don't underestimate that Southern accent. He's one possibility. The other is J.B. Pitzer, the governor of Illinois. He's somebody that is the heir to the Hyatt hotel fortune. So what does that mean? He has money, and he can spend on the campaign. The other one, Kamala Harris, one advantage she does have is that because she was on the ticket with Joe Biden, she can actually keep some of the money that the Biden-Harris campaign raised and use
okay,
that. So that's the advantage that he has. The problem is she's unpopular, but I actually think that Roy Cooper would probably be the most formidable candidate, probably the hardest candidate for Donald Trump to try to caricature right now. You hear a lot about Gavin Newsom, the governor of
yep,
California. I think the biggest criticism of him is going to be that he's from California. The fact that he's literally was the former mayor of San Francisco, be very easy for Donald Trump to allegate him with Nancy Pelosi. There's an old slogan called the San Francisco Liberal. It came out of the 1984 Democratic National Convention with Jeane Kirkpatrick. She was giving a speech and she said the San Francisco Liberal because the convention was happening in San Francisco. So after that, the Democratic Party tried to formulate a Democratic Leadership Council to make the party un-San Francisco-like. So the idea that you have somebody from San Francisco as a Democratic Party nominee, that could definitely be to the detriment, I think, of the Democratic Party. But that being said, he's very formidable and he's very good on his feet. If you saw his debate with Ron DeSantis last year,
oh yeah,
he's extremely formidable, and he very much is the rare to central casting in terms of looking for like a politician.
oh, absolutely, yeah, and he was all over the spin room last night. He was doing
Yes, he
interviews
was.
everywhere, and he loves getting the. I mean, he'll deflect that question, but he loves getting that question. What if they come to you, and something's to happen? Oh, I couldn't even think of that. That's my favorite. Is how they handle the hypothetical questions by, oh no, this is our nominee and this is our party, and they're very good at handling that one, but they love it. I was watching Cuomo on
Yep.
what I don't even know the
News
station,
Nation.
News Nation, and he had on Adam Carolla
Oh yeah.
and Stephen A. Smith, and they brought in Newsom, and Stephen A. Smith asked him a question, and then Carolla said, "Why'd you shut the beaches down during COVID?" And Newsom's, "Well, you shut the beaches down. That's when people should have been outside." He goes, "And then what about outdoor dining? There's pictures of you all over the place, outdoor dining, and you shut it down for everybody." So Newsom is backpedaling, has no idea what to say. And then he says, "Well, understand that a lot of the stuff that was done under the guidance of the White House. And your guy, President Trump, was president at the time." It was great.
Those are all things. I think the idea of that is something, and also the fact that he's actually had a recall effort, which he survived
Oh,
in
I know.
California. Those are all things that I think Donald Trump is salivating about trying to run against him. But that's true though. Every time Donald Trump criticizes Gavin Newsom about what he did during COVID, Gavin Newsom can go right back and say, "Well, that's what came from the White House," and he can try
Yes.
to go right after Donald Trump. He's in kind of a really sui generis position in that respect.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. No, I mean, I think, you know, if we already weren't getting the popcorn ready, we certainly are, especially after last night. And I
Yelling from
mean,
the peanut gallery.
oh boy. And I mean, I don't. You think Trump will do another debate? Do you think he'll do one?
I would think my guess is yes, because, and the reason I say this, Trump loves debates and Trump has a very high opinion of himself.
Oh yeah.
And I think he thinks he's the best debater since Cicero. So theoretically, I think he would say,
Believe me.
what's that?
Believe me. He'll tell you this. He'll point and tell you and how great he is. I'm the best. And
Oh yes, yes, that whole accordion thing he's got. The accordion is great. That's yeah, I think he would absolutely do another debate. I think he figures that he's going to, if he beat Joe Biden the first time, he'll say, I can beat Joe Biden the second time. Will Joe Biden do a second